start this. Okay, so we are welcoming Betty Ann Brown tonight to talk about phenomenology, and this is the Kipaipai Happy Hour. I'm kind of your host, Andy Campagnoni. You won't see me though. You're only going to be able to see Betty unless you have your screen set to something else. But tonight we're super excited about this presentation. It will be recorded. At the end of the presentation, you can ask questions, but you can also drop them in the chat. I will be keeping track of those for Betty throughout the presentation. So if something comes up, I'll be able to let her know. And anyway, let's give it up for Betty Ann Brown.
Thank you so much, Andy. You know, thank God for Andy Campagnoni. So much of what we have all done has been facilitated by her graceful style and energy. And thank you, Andy. I realize that some of you have heard the other two talks I did, but some of you have not. So I am just going to say that what they were about was how you understand abstraction. And this is really a third part of that. To remind you, I introduced the whole concept of abstraction by talking about art history. I am, after all, an art historian. And I talked about how realism has been over history, and it continues to be today, the dominant artistic mode that most people understand and appreciate. So realism is supposed to look real. It's supposed to mimic the visible world. Realism usually has some kind of narrative, and viewers know the story that is in that narrative. And realism is linked to skill, to technical excellence. I think this is a perfect example of realism and how it endured over millennia, because as I'm sure you all know, Michelangelo's David was inspired by a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture. So for over 1,000 years, realism was based on the ancient world. The second modality that I presented in those two lectures was expressionism. Again, you all know what this is. The artist expresses his or her feelings and hopes to generate the same feelings in us. I'm just using perhaps one of the best known examples of expressionist art by, of course, the most amazing Vincent van Gogh. And I love this quote from a letter he wrote about that painting to his brother Theo, where he says, you know, I'm an expressionist. I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. So Van Gogh was really aware that he was distorting color and form for expressive purposes. And this is key, he deliberately de-skilled his technique. So I just said that realism was about technical excellence, and now I'm suggesting that expressionism often involved de-skilling. That is, not trying to be technically precise, in fact, going the opposite direction. So the third modality I introduced was formalism. And technically that is art that is considered significant form. And the premise for formalism is that aesthetic judgment can be detached from content, meaning moral or social ones. And formalists give importance to the purely abstract compositional qualities. The visual elements such as point, line, color, shape, texture, and so forth. This is the very well-known formalist Pete Mondrian, who believed that his very reductive, very formal, very abstract compositions would have the goal, would achieve the goal of promoting clarity, balance, peace, and reason. Now, I showed you guys this slide, And I just bring it back. I showed you all of these slides so far, and I just wanted to bring it back to remind you that I already kind of was pointing at phenomenology. Indeed, phenomenology is a kind of philosophy. It's a philosophical practice, and it is particularly pertinent to abstract formalist work. It is not rational, like Plato's theories that were logical and reasonable and of the mind. But phenomenology is a method of reflective attentiveness that discloses the individual's lived experience. Before I go on, I should say that reflective attentiveness is also the goal of the cultural practice that we call meditation. Your goal is to focus your attention completely on either a mantra or your breath, or perhaps a candle that you're staring at. And that attentiveness in meditation is expressly for spiritual purposes. As we go through phenomenology, you'll see that a lot of this abstract formalist art is intended to have a spiritual element. Plato was absolutely about objective study. That is, it had to be something that was universal and understood and shared. In contrast, phenomenology is about the subjective, the inherently individual and personal reactions we have to this paying attention, in this case, for our purposes today, to art. So, phenomenology can be defined as a philosophical pursuit that studies the lived experience. It studies what our minds do, the structures of consciousness, from a first-person, individual, subjective point of view. And it's often used, not just by me, but it's used by a lot of people to interpret abstract formalist minimal art. As I said earlier, and I'll repeat again, the central structure of an experience is its intentionality, the fact that it is directed toward something. I mean, I'm hoping that your intentionality is directed towards the slides on your screen right now. But whatever you're paying attention to, your intention is about that thing, that object, that mantra, that yoga position, that breathing cycle, or that work of art. And to understand what this means, here are some artworks that can be really pertinent to phenomenology, or I should say, here's some artworks to which phenomenology can be really pertinent. I'm not Chinese and I don't speak Mandarin, so I may butcher this name, but what you're seeing on the screen, faded out so I could put text on top of it, is one of my favorite things I've ever seen at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art by the Chinese artist Zhu Jinshi. It's called The Wave, and we'll come back to it later today. How do we experience his piece? How do we experience Donald Judd's minimalist sculptures? And how do we experience Rothko's emotive paintings? How do we? And what does that say about the art and our attention to that art? So tonight I'm going to use the theories of phenomenology to develop answers to these 4 questions. 1, what does this painting mean? What does this artwork mean? What does this installation mean? What does this sculpture mean? What does it mean? How can I understand it? How can I touch on that meaning and embody it so that I really fully understand it? Number 3, how can I explain it to somebody else? Why is it, how can I talk about it to people? This is a real challenge to so many art makers. It's hard to talk about your work for a lot of abstract artists. And finally, why is it so important to see the artwork in person rather than in a reproduction. So if we even get one of those down tonight, we will have accomplished a lot. And my hope is that what we do together will help all of you answer all 4 of those questions. So to do that, I'm choosing to look at phenomenology. By the way, I should tell you that Catherine Ruane was the one who suggested, one might even say, urged me to do this talk on phenomenology. So if you don't like it in the end, blame her. All right. Number 1, here are 6 key aspects of phenomenology. First of all, and this is really fundamental, there are multiple ways of knowing. You can know something in your logical, rational mind. You can know something with your emotions and feelings. And you can know something from your body through sensations. These are all different kinds of knowing. Number 2, and I already mentioned this, but it bears repeating. Intentionality. Our awareness is always directed to or about something. So I'm asking you to direct your attention to this painting, which I'm sure you all know is a Mark Rothko. Knowing, especially knowing in the logical, rational way, is based on naming. The challenge of emotional or body knowing is that as a culture, we haven't really developed a language. We haven't really named what emotional intelligence and body intelligence really are and what they do. So we're a little handicapped in terms of knowing through naming. Number 4, to perceive something clearly, we need to shed our preconceptions, which is to say the names we have given it. For me to give you the name of Mark Rothko in reference to this painting calls forth all of your long-held previous associations with that name and with his art. And they veil your looking freshly at this work. So we have to shed those preconceptions in order to really see something. Number 5, this process of paying attention and being in the moment as we do so can slow us down, quiet us, and like meditation, it can reward with a deep body knowing, a knowing that is visceral. For some viewers, this is a spiritual experience. I should say that although I'm focusing on abstract art today, I think that all art can give us this gift of calling us to slow down and pay attention, whether it's abstract or not. In fact, I think that's one of the best things that art can do to the general public. We're all so used to quick, immediate imagery on television commercials that being compelled to look slowly, quietly, and if you will, meditatively is a great gift to our sanity. And art is the best giver of that gift. Related to this is number 6. Seeing an artwork in person is the only way to truly experience it in your body. And seeing an artwork in person allows you to come into contact with what the critic Walter Benjamin calls its aura. If you're not familiar with that term, hold on. I'll introduce it to you in a minute. Okay, so phenomenology studies the structure of various types of experience. I call them mental, emotional, and physical, but all of those kinds of knowing involve perception, thought, memory, imagination, emotion, desire, volition, embodied action, social activity, and linguistic activity. Our experience in all of these kinds of perception is directed towards, is intentional, only through particular concepts, thoughts, and ideas. So remember I said to you, looking at this painting As soon as I called it a Rothko, that brought forth all your historic associations about Rothko, his art, the horrible experience you had at the museum with the Rothko, the radiant response you had to a Rothko. All those things came forth as soon as I said that. And they are all ideas that you had before looking at that slide. In other words, they were all preconceptions. Phenomenology tells us the only way we can really see and experience something is to let go of those filtering concepts. So what do I mean by that, and how basic is that? Well, here is a little exercise in filtering concepts. First of all, can you think of yourself as simply human? Not male, not female, not old, young, black, white, rich, poor. Can you think of yourself as simply human? Can you get rid of all those things about gender, class, race, and so forth? Just simply human. Can you take it further? Can you think of yourself as simply being? Not a human, not a mammal, not an animal, just beingness. Can you shed all the labels that we have constructed to give ourselves meaning, all the words we use to define ourselves and create meaning for our lives? And for today, can you shed the labels we have constructed to give art meaning? Phenomenology asks us to erase the world of rational speculation by returning to our primordial experience of the matter, whether the object is a feeling, an idea, or a perception. We often have visceral responses related to deep inward body feelings, rather than the emotions or the intellect. But as I said, our culture has not given us the language for that. And it's hard to talk about something when you don't have the words. It's hard to communicate. So this is an attempt to language those issues and see what that languaging can tell us. Mark Rothko, I'm sure you all know, was not only a brilliant painter, but he was very articulate as well. And he made very clear that he was not doing representational art. He said a painting is not a picture of an experience. It is the experience. So how can we shed our rational filters to experience a Rothko directly? What is that direct experience? Is it a spiritual experience? Well, as I said, one theoretical term that might help us to answer this is aura. And aura was introduced in critical theory by the German theorist Walter Benjamin in his fundamentally important essay called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And what Benjamin tells us is that we are more and more and more experiencing life, the world, other people indirectly through representations or reproductions of them. The most ridiculous example I always think of is, people who go to Vegas and look at that Eiffel Tower may be mistakenly thinking that they're seeing the Eiffel Tower and they're having the experience that they would in Paris, but I'm here to tell you they're not. They're looking at a work of art, the Eiffel Tower, in a mechanical reproduction. By the way, it is not even full scale. And what Benjamin says to us is that even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art, like even if that Vegas Eiffel Tower was completely full scale and an exact duplicate, it still lacks one element. It still will never be perceived in the time and space matrix that the one in Paris is. We will never understand the Eiffel Tower's unique existence in the place where it is if we're just trying to get to it through that vagus reproduction. Benjamin refers to the unique cultural context. That is, in our case, the work of art, its presence in time and space. He calls that presence in time and space, its unique cultural context. He calls it the aura. I just want to, I really apologize for this slide. I could not find a better reproduction of this image. And I don't have my Benjamin books anymore since I gave away my library. So this is off the internet and it's poo-poo, but I hope you can read a lot of it. So it diagrams Benjamin's relationship to meaning, language, and art. And he talks about creation, as you can see in the upper left there, as the capacity of naming. Hold that thought. Then scanning over to the right, we see God in the dominant central position. And Benjamin talks about God as having the most perfect language. And this is a straight up biblical reference. For example, John 1:1 begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Benjamin is echoing this biblical reference, saying that God is in the language we use to talk about creation. Then he goes on at the far left to talk about man having the perfect language of naming. And I'm going to go ahead and then I'm going to come back to this, bear with me. So here's the biblical reference to that. In Genesis, it says that God created all the animals and birds and flowers and so forth, and he brought them to Adam, the man, to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. That was its meaning. That was the context for it. The man gave names to all the birds and beasts. So we as human beings have this capacity to name things and thereby give them meaning. And one more point here, down here. It says that knowledge is the translation of the mute language of things into man's naming language. I want you to hear those words. The mute language of things. Things don't speak. They do not name themselves. Man names them, and man's language is naming. When I enrolled my now 37-year-old son in preschool, we took him to the campus and walked around, and I saw that what they had done as a way to help the kids start reading was they had put signs on all the things on the campus. So there were signs on trees and rocks and buildings. They had named all these things, and they were teaching the children those names. I hope that makes sense to you all. Anyway, at the very bottom of this diagram, it says that art is an imperfect language because it is nameless. Hear that again. It's a language. Art is a language, but it's an imperfect language because it's nameless. So we don't have a name for this. I mean, we can call it a Rothko painting, but you know, that's what we would call that and that and that. The unique auric presence of this painting, we don't have a name for that. But we do have strong physical feelings in response to the painting. So phenomenology is trying to help us negotiate that, problem. We have all these experiences that we don't know how to name. I'm sure you're all aware of the Rothko Chapel in Houston. If you have not been there, I absolutely insist that you go. Put this on your bucket list. It will be one of the great art experiences of your life, I promise you. Rothko joined Philip Johnson to design this, and he did it to, finish his bucket list, which was to create a series of site-specific paintings that would have greater visual impact than any of his earlier works. I want you to remember that, because towards the end today, I'm going to talk about Donald Judd and how he tried to accomplish the same thing, not in a chapel, but in an old disused military base in West Texas. So, one more theoretical construct before we really start talking about the art. And this is a professor at Claremont, speaking at Claremont, Andy. And I can't say his last name, so I always call him in my mind Mihaly. That's his first name. I don't know him. It's insulting to use his first name, but there you have it. And in 1990, he wrote he's the guy who first theorized the flow experience. I know a lot of you know about the flow experience, and I've mentioned it to some of you in our conversation. So he writes about the relationship between meaning and experience. And he strongly feels that if we as human beings can find meaning in the ongoing stream of experience, in the process of living, the burden of social controls falls off. We can have a direct connection with the process of living. He further talks about the fact that religion is actually the oldest and most ambitious attempt to create order or meaning in consciousness. It therefore makes sense that religious rituals would be a profound source of enjoyment. I think it also therefore makes sense that this gathering of paintings that is intended to have a visceral impact calls forth religious responses to a lot of people. Art predates all institutionalized religions by hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. Art is also an attempt to find meaning in this ongoing stream of experience. So there are intriguing parallels between art and religion. And we're going to talk more about that as well. One more Benjamin statement. He said, to perceive the aura of an object we look at means to invest it with the ability to look at us in return. James Elkins, a very well-known art writer alive today, published, and I think, I'm not going to remember the date of this, a book called The Object Stares Back. And so he's engaging with Benjamin's concept of the aura, saying we really get into art when we give it when we acknowledge its ability to stare back at us. We give it agency. It's looking at us. It's a reciprocal engagement. Okay, so I would like to talk about 5 artists in particular, and let's just see if we get through them all in an hour. And this is, as you all know already, a photograph of the wonderful Ruth Pastine. I interviewed her in, August 7th, I think it was. And she spoke so eloquently about the phenomenology of her artwork, of experiencing her artwork, that I have quoted her extensively here. So much of what I'm about to say is in Ruth's words, as you will see by the fact that I put quotes around it and credit it to her. Pastine creates really, often really large, as you can see here, paintings and drawings that are often based on complementary color combinations, like this one is blue and orange. As we looked at her work, she spoke about how her paintings reveal themselves over time in a play between intentionality, there's that phenomenological term, and discovery. So we pay attention to the work, we quiet our minds, we come into the moment, we bathe in its aura, and we discover. We're rewarded by this practice. She says, my work needs to be experienced in person. Viewers have to have an optical and physical connection to the work itself. Viewers need to be present enough to be open to visceral perception. That is all true. And it tells you why the idea of seeing the actual work and the understanding that it does things, you have to take on faith. Because I'm the first to admit that these slides are not going to do it for you. You've got to take it on faith, and I hope sincerely that very soon you can all see some of these amazing, glorious paintings in person and have that experience of being bathed in these fields of color. As Pastine says, the paintings present the opportunity for present moment awareness. They call upon us to be present in the moment right then in this space and time. If you sit in front of a Ruth Pastine painting and think about how much money is in your checking account and when you're going to actually do those dishes, you're missing the point. The point is to focus your intention on looking and see how the painting rewards you right then in space and time, and what it does to you as you look, perceive, and embody your response. Pastine says the paintings reveal themselves over time. Light, which changes at different seasons, different times of the day, can appear to be emitting from the surface, which is, in a way, what Benjamin meant by the painting looks back. This light seems to come towards us. It seems to look at us. Pastine says her paintings relate to color field and minimalist paintings, as well as to the light and space movement. She is, by the way, perhaps the most articulate artist I've ever interviewed, with the single exception possibly of David Hockney. She's incredibly articulate, eloquent, so savvy. I encourage you all to see her work, and if you have a chance, talk with her about it. Anyway, she's influenced by color field, minimalism, and light and space. And hearing that, I remembered that I had just recently seen a phenomenal light and space piece at the Benton Museum in Claremont. It's by Pasadena resident HELEN PASHGIAN. And this is an installation that she calls Primavera. And when it's in a room, it occupies a whole room at the museum, and you stand outside the room and look in. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a video. I recognized that things were changing, and I thought it was done by video projection. But it wasn't until I walked around and really spent some time with it that I realized there is a disc, like that disc, with color on it. And the color is done in such a way that as light moves over the disc, it changes phenomenally. So although I'm absolutely sure that I can walk through museums and spend 10 seconds on each artwork, I'm not proud of that, but I have done it. You can't do that with this. You have to sit down or stand there quietly and watch for a long time. And the more you eliminate all the peripheral mind clatter, the more you experience the piece authentically in and of itself. I can't tell you how strongly I want to urge you all to please go see one of her works. The one at the Benton is killer. Here's a related piece. I like the close-up on the left because you can see the edge of the disc. And on the right, you can see how that edge disappears into the installation. So it looks like this whisper of color hovering and changing in the middle of a room. So gorgeous. So here's Pashgian. She is pushing 90. She lives here in Pasadena, and that's where I live. And in 2014, she had a major exhibition at LACMA called Transcending the Material. And I should point out that a lot of minimal art that we focus on, what we focus on is its materials, its materiality. So as I said, looking at this, I focused on the color and the way the changing light made the color change. It's a stunner. So I've been using the term minimalism a lot, and I know those of you who heard it before saw something close to this slide, but I'm bringing it back because not everybody was. Minimalism is the extremely reductive mode of geometric abstraction that began in early modernism with Malevich, who I'll show you in a minute. And by the middle of the century, it can be seen as a reaction against the painterly and emotionally charged work of the action painting abex masters, Pollock, Motherwell, so on. It emerged in the 50s as a counterpoint to abex and flourished in the 60s, and it continues today. Those Ruth Paskin and those those Ruth Pastine and those HELEN PASHGIAN, sorry about that, are very much minimal. Minimalism has also been called the art of primary structures. The first person to theorize minimalism and use that term primary structures was Barbara Rose. And I'm sorry to tell those of you who don't know, she died last December. So we lost her too. Minimalism is stripped to its most fundamental features, line, shape, color, texture, etc. And early minimalists looked at Clement Greenberg's ideas and took them literally. He said that painting should be reduced to the materials on a flat surface and that sculpture is reduced to the elemental forms. He talked about the modernist reduction, and minimalism becomes the ultimate reductive practice. As Carl Andre proclaimed, art excludes the unnecessary. So also last time I spoke of this artist, and I'm going to race through her stuff, but if you don't know her, I recommend you finding some of her works in person. She was phenomenal, Agnes Martin, and her work is so subtle that it totally resists reproduction. That photograph looks like we've got a blank canvas with possibly a pale gray wash over it. That is not what's going on there. She does tiny, hand-drawn with pencil grids across her surfaces, and they are so subtle and evocative that you can't see them in most reproductions. I threw this one in so that you could see that there are these tiny lines weaving over the surface. And I promise you, they call you to contemplation. They call you to that quiet moment of stillness. And she talks about this quiet moment of stillness being spiritual. And she claimed the spiritual nature of her work. I like this. My paintings are about quiet happening, happiness like the light in the morning. I look in my mind and I see composition. Can you see those really, really pale horizontal stripes in kind of a gray, smoky gray, and then the color in between them? So this is her large painting, Gratitude. These are some of her small drawings. Many viewers can't get into Agnes Martin's work at all, especially people who see them only in reproduction. So much minimal art requires direct experience that a lot of people who are only seeing art in reproduction don't get minimal art. And it has been very controversial and been protested indeed. But even in Taos, New Mexico, where Agnes Martin spent the end of her life, they have in the museum created an 8-sided room for her paintings with Philip Johnson boxes in the, no, not Philip Johnson, Donald Judd boxes for people to sit on as they contemplate them. So we've just seen 2 abstract minimal artists, Rothko and Agnes Martin, whose works are now housed in chapels. I think that's pretty clear indication that something spiritual is going on here. Of course, that's nothing new. We all know that over 100 years ago, this elegant, aristocratic Russian Vassily Kandinsky claimed spiritual art as a spiritual, he claimed abstract art as a spiritual practice. I'm sure you all know that some of his abstractions are loose and painterly, and these he often called improvisations. Others were more geometric and hard-edged. He often called them compositions. And I'm sure you also know that in 1910, he wrote a book about abstract art that he called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. This book is a textual confirmation that many modern abstract artists created their work as part of a spiritual quest. I think the best way to see that is to look at this Kasimir Malevich guy who I mentioned earlier. And again, I showed you these in the talk my second talk. But Malevich considered his abstract paintings modern replacements for religious icons. And he thought they were the supreme iconic images, and he called them suprematism. Traditionally, Russian icons were placed high in corners to overlook the entire room. So I don't know if you can make out in this kind of pixelated image, but that's Jesus up in the corner overlooking the room. And here we have the Virgin Mary up in the corner, again, overlooking the room. In his first major exhibition, Kasimir Malevich put the black square in the place, the honored place of the Russian religious icon. He considered this an abstract symbol for the divine. It was created just before the onset of World War I. In other words, in a very troubled Russia and a very troubled Europe. And he referred to it as the void. I should have mentioned earlier that Rothko often spoke of his work as the void as well. And some people really have trouble understanding how this could refer to the divine, how this could be spiritual. But I just remind you that the Kaaba in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, is the most sacred site in Islam. And what is it but a great big black cube? And popular culture has imaged the divine in a great big black geometric shape as well. The monolith in the 1968 film 2001, the presence of superior intelligence. What else are you going to call the divine? This was the popular culture depiction. So all of these depict the divine as a geometric form. I don't know that Michelangelo could have ever understood that, but I hope that we can today, since it is clearly a cultural issue. But Malevich's divine didn't just come in black and the void. Here is his white on white, done actually, obviously, during World War I. I think this is the Zhu Jinshi that I started out with. And he's a painter mostly, and his paintings look very abstract expressionist, very expressive. But he also does installations that are very material based, very abstract, and very minimal, and that are just wow. This is one of my favorite things I've ever seen at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I hope you get an idea of the scale. There are tens of thousands of pieces of handmade paper folded and gathered to make this immense wave that is held in place by string. These vertical lines are all strings, and the strings are anchored by these rocks. So we have paper, string, and rocks. Very much about the materials. Indeed, he calls it the wave of materials. Now, I think that the wave harks back to one of the most iconic images in Japanese art, Hokusai's wave from 1831. And I just don't think that, you can call something a wave and not acknowledge that the wave has been an icon for some time. But Zhu Jinshi is not Japanese, he's Chinese. And this piece deals with Chinese paper that is, as you can see here, a mixture of hemp, mulberry, and other natural plant fibers. It's used for calligraphy and ink drawings, but he is using it as a material symbol. The materials are the ones that are symbolic, and he suspends it, isolating the viewers within the work and creating what it says right here at Lockman, the overwhelming presence of Eastern art within a Western space. So my suggestion to you is that seeing this work puts you inside the paper, inside the string, inside the rocks, and makes you accept in your body the presence of these amazing poetic materials. And many of you are familiar with great big sculptures and great big installations that throw you into your body because they don't have an easy explanation and force you to experience space in a different way. One of the sculptors who does this so eloquently is Anish Kapoor. And this is his Cloud Gate in Chicago, which takes basically a great big black ovoid and blocks the view from the lake towards downtown. Another artist who does great big minimal sculpture that distorts the space and makes you reconsider both the materiality of what he's working with, but also how you relate to that space, is Richard Serra. And I'm sure you all know that Richard Serra has one of his most glorious installations at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And this piece is so huge. And the metal that it's made of is so heavy and dense and weighty. It almost, weighs you down as you look at it. It throws you out of your intellect and into a body response. The only thing I could relate this to you guys is when you go to a haunted house in an amusement park, they often use slanting walls and floors to disorient you. I think you can have a similar reaction to standing inside a Serra piece. I don't know if you can tell from this, but this is two different pieces of metal. When I say pieces, that trivializes them. They're bigger than your house, and they are canted so that they lean. In this case, looking at them, they're leaning to the left. And when you walk through it, you kind of have to angle your body not to hit your shoulder against the piece on the right. So it compels you to go into a different body response. And that body response is what Sarah is after. Now, the piece that is called the Sistine Chapel of Minimalism was created by this man, Donald Judd. And Donald Judd is very well known for his minimal sculptures that are geometric, composed of industrial materials, and have no story, no symbolism, no narrative, real or implied. You're just looking at rectangles, boxes, squares. And honestly, I didn't get Judd when I saw him in museums. There is a version of this sculpture at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. This one's at the Hirshhorn, and I've seen it 1,000 times, and I honestly didn't get it until I understood, like Donald Judd, that seeing his works in museums and galleries, surrounded by works by other people, doesn't really do anything. He realized this. And so what Judd did was he decided to create a space like his own Rothko or Martin Chapel out in Podunk, West Texas, in a town called Marfa. Years before, when Judd had been in the military, he'd taken a train ride that went through Marfa, Texas. And he was taken by the austere environment of West Texas. In 1979, he purchased an old army barracks in Marfa, West Texas. So there's Marfa for you, right by this famous bend in the Rio Grande River. It's actually really beautiful. Here is a diagram of the military base. And these are all big spaces that housed people. And these back here, these two things, are like hangars. Airplanes could go into them, tanks go into them, and so forth. So Judd took over those two hangars, and installed what is considered the Sistine Chapel of Minimalism. He called it, romantically, 100 Untitled Works of Mill Aluminum. And I have got to tell you, I mean this sincerely, I didn't get Judd. I didn't like Judd. I never had an experience with Judd until I walked into this room in Marfa, Texas, and I was blown away. I mean, literally. I kept gasping. It is so beautiful. It's really, really hard to describe. And it does something to you to be around all this evocative visual beauty. They do not, in Marfa, they do not want you to photograph, because they want you to be in the experience. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. If we look at everything through a camera, we're not directing and we're not experiencing it directly in our bodies in that time and space. So these are official photographs. Every one of these is a metal rectangle with openings and voids, and they're all different. So you can see that this is an opening down here, and then there's a horizontal bar there, and then this is reflective aluminum surface, but that's open, that's aluminum. And then if you look up here, there's another reflective aluminum surface, and what that's reflecting is the ceiling above it. There are windows on both sides of this hanger, and the big rectangles in front of them are reflecting the outside. the big sky of West Texas. Every one of them is different. Everyone reflects you as you walk through the building, which means that you become part of the artwork and it's calling out to you to spend some time and get into it. And please take my word on this. By the way, the 100 boxes, squares, cubes, whatever, are spread out over both of these. So this one has a cement ceiling and this one's ceiling is slightly different. This one has brick at the end. This one doesn't. They're slightly different. You're looking at the two different. It doesn't matter. They're all incredibly glorious. Part of the reason is that they are reflective. And so they disappear and reappear as you walk around. You sometimes show up in them. At other times, because of the angles and the way the light works, you don't. So he has used light, space, matter, geometry, and math to give us an in the body experience of, in my mind, radiant beauty. You know, Andy, one thing I've been thinking about is we should take a trip to Marfa, take a Kipaipai trip to Marfa. I would love to share this with everybody.
It's on the list.
I just think we need to go.
It's definitely on the list.
It's just so good. And Marfa is not by any means just Judd's work, although he did create it so that he would be able to show his work in and of itself, not competing with other artists. This space only holds his work, but there are many other spaces at this Army base. And one of them, for example, is given to Dan Flavin. I'm sure you all know his neon installations, and I'm sure you also know that they completely alter the space that they're put in. I think this altering the space, calling your attention, getting you to slow down and be spiritual, that's a phenomenological response. I'm trying to give it words, but there's no way for me to match the visceral experience of seeing these, or even of seeing these, with language. So phenomenology is a philosophy that resists rational articulation. Instead, it insists on you being present with the art and letting it flow over, through, around, and as you. I urge you to consider that being part of your response to art always, whenever you are lucky enough to see it in person and experience its aura. I put 2 more slides into this presentation that are what is most often called art speak. You guys, this thing here on this slide is 1 sentence. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'd be more than happy to email it to anybody who thinks they can get through it. I did get through it. But basically what it's saying is, what phenomenology does is bring us into a certain space and time so that we're aware of that space and we're aware of that time. And then it asks us to put our attention there and become aware of our own experience in that space and time. So we're aware of what we are paying attention to, but we're also aware of ourselves as we pay that attention. We can be moved in our bodies. We can be moved with language and with social interaction. And if we listen to this quiet, still moment with art, we can carry that awareness into our everyday lives. We can carry that meaning of the body into our everyday lives. If you are a critical theory buff, you're probably wondering, where did I get all these ideas? Well, here's where. Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and my man, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. They all talk about phenomenological issues of intention, paying attention, consciousness, how aware are we and in what way are we aware? The quality of that experience, and the first person, you as an individual, you subjective, your perspective. Phenomenology is often in a kind of superficial way limited to sensations, but I think it's a bigger picture. I think it is something that calls our attention to the significance of objects, events, tools, the flow of time, the self, and others, not just sensations, but how all these things arise and are experienced in our life world. So guys, that's it. I really hope that you understood that. I tried to make it as clear as possible. If you have any more questions, you can always ask me and email me.
Hold tight, Betty. I do have some questions for you. There were quite a few, but I didn't want to interrupt you while you were speaking. I know Annie Seaton asks, so is phenomenology always associated with minimalism? And
No.
can it, okay, so there's one. And can it be more expressive work with materials?
It can be. I mean, I think that Rothko is often considered an expressive artist, isn't he?
Yes. Also, she would like to know, how much is it about emotions versus reductive materials, which is more important?
Yeah, that's a false dichotomy.
Okay.
Because the emotions are arise in response to the materials. So they're absolutely connected. It's not an either or thing.
Okay, so hold on. I'm going to ask you some other questions here.
Okay, but Annie, did you understand what I just said?
Yeah, mute myself. Yeah, I just meant reductive materials, meaning like minimalism again. Like everything is so, like the examples you showed were all so minimal. So
I don't think that Chinese example was minimal, is it?
No, I don't.
Pretty minimal. It's pretty zen.
Well,
yeah.
and you know, and I use the term meditation a lot.
Yeah.
And Zen is a meditative practice. So yeah.
But and if you think about it, I mean, it could only really work in a minimalist presentation, because the more we add information, the more language is included in that, and then it's hard to get past the kind of preconceived already ideas, thoughts,
Exactly.
language that's attached to it. So it really does have to be kind of this sensory, very simple, minimal sensory thing that happens, so that you can get there. Otherwise, you have all this stuff already happening, and you can never have your experience in that time and place.
Right. Okay.
I think you're absolutely right, Andy, but I also think that if we flex our phenomenological muscles and really try to be experiencing the time and space and the aura of the art, it is possible in a perfect world that we could learn to drop our preconceptions about narrative art and try to experience them just in a physical, direct, meditative way. Hard.
Wow, that's an exercise.
That's an exercise, but it is possible.
Yeah.
So good question, Annie.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me just quickly see if there's a couple more here. I'm looking for questions. And I think that was it. There was an early question by Jean. Let's see, Jeannie had a really early question that I thought was interesting.
Done.
Yeah, but I can't find it now.
Jeannie, are you there? Unmute yourself.
Oh, here it is. Can you tell us what cultures experience art without all the rational American filters or Western culture filters that we construct because we are isolated from much of the world by two oceans?
Okay, so I'm going to challenge that question. I think that the way that question is posed is a little confusing to me, because I think the native cultures in the Americas created phenomenally powerful work that doesn't always have figurative content. A lot of Native American art is abstract. People don't usually credit Native Americans with inventing abstract art, but they sure did it. And I also think that the connection of so much Native American art with ritual lends to a phenomenological reading. Does that help?
I hope so. I think, let's see.
Okay.
I think that was it. Those are the questions. I just wanted to make sure I got those covered before we said goodnight.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Unmute yourself. Nope.
I just wanted to add, Betty, that is it that we're only now really truly appreciating Native American and Aboriginal culture finally for what it presents to us. We've been blind to it in the past. I mean, a lot of people have not been blind to it, mind you, but general education and general conversation and practice has left out that voice.
Well, I think you're right in that. I think as an educator, I can say that a lot of education has been racist, absolutely. And a lot of universities up until very, very recently taught only about the accomplishments of white people, universities in our country. But I don't think that's true of all. I, for one, got a PhD in Aztec art almost 50 years ago. So it was already being appreciated strongly by some art history departments.
For sure.
That tells you how old I am too, doesn't it?
Join the
All
club.
right. So I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and thank you, Betty, so much for another really awesome presentation. We will be doing another one hopefully in September. Sant Khalsa will be giving us a presentation on the art world and how it has evolved and your relationship with it. It should be very interesting. I don't have an exact date yet. But I will announce that on I'mAnArtist.net and also on the Facebook page. Anyway, in the meantime, it's super great to see all of you. And again, thank you, Betty. And we'll see you guys soon.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. That was
Thank you.
phenomenal.
So inspiring.
Thank you.